So now going on to the rest of the conference, our next event is a panel that is very related to the keynote we just heard, addressing governance and incentives. Our moderator for this panel is Ari Fitzgerald. Ari leads the communications, internet, and media practice at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. You can, of course, find a full bio for him on the conference webpage. So over to you, Ari.
Thank you. And I'm really enjoying this conference thus far. I'm going to start us off. First of all, I have to tell you, we have the A-team here with us as panelists. So I think we're going to have a very robust discussion. Let me set things off a bit by just saying that historically, the US, like most developed countries, has taken a centralized top-down approach to determining how spectrum is used and by whom. Spectrum regulators, the Federal Communications Commission, and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration have generally allocated spectrum for particular like or compatible uses and assign rights to use that spectrum by granting licenses. While this approach has largely been successful in minimizing harmful interference, it has at times led to underutilization. And the traditional methods for allocating and reallocating spectrum are cumbersome and slow, as you heard, compared to the pace at which technology is evolving. In recent years, the US government has prioritized spectrum sharing as a potential solution to these challenges. And we've heard a lot of discussion about the PCAST report that was issued during the Obama administration that really sort of expressed a desire for more spectrum sharing. While spectrum sharing is a promising idea, it raises many questions, some of which we will address today on today's panel. So let me introduce our panelists. As I said before, we have the A-team with us today. Coleman Bazelon, first I'm going to introduce Coleman Bazelon. He's a principal at the Brattle Group. He has consulted and testified on matters ranging from wireless license auctions, spectrum management generally, and broadband competition policy, and regularly appears before regulatory and legislative bodies, including the FCC and Congress. Lynn Cali is the Senior Vice President of Global Public Policy at AT&T and is responsible for developing AT&T's positions on telecom policy issues. He also serves as AT&T's representative on the board of directors of the U.S. Council on International Business. Andy Clegg is the spectrum engineering lead for Google. He was a major player in the adoption and implementation of the FCC's 3.5 citizens CBRS, I'll use an acronym, CBRS service rules, as founding chair of the Wireless Innovation Forum's group responsible for CBRS functional standards. And then finally, Vernita Harris, who is the Director of Spectrum Policy and Programs Directorate in the Department of Defense's Office of the Chief Information Officer. In this position, Vernita oversees the implementation of DoD policies regarding the management and use of spectrum and is responsible for developing and advancing the DoD's spectrum, internet, and information and telecommunications policy positions. Before we start, before we launch into questions, I would like to mention that in view of the quiet period applicable under the FCC's anti-collusion rules for all applicants seeking to participate in the upcoming FCC Auction 110 for licenses in the 3.45 to 5.5 gigahertz band, the panelists here have agreed not to take any questions regarding that auction or the 3.45 to 5.5 gigahertz band generally. So there will be no questions or discussion about that band or that auction. Let me start us off with a question for all of our panelists. The focus of this panel is on governance and incentives for spectrum sharing. That assumes that there is consensus on the need for more spectrum sharing among dissimilar uses. Do you agree that spectrum sharing should be encouraged? And if so, under what conditions should it occur? And why don't we, I'll ask Coleman to get us started.
Thank you, Ari, and really appreciate being included on this panel. So if your question is, should there, am I for spectrum sharing? Yes, more the merrier. The question really is why we don't see more of it. And I think the answer to when we should be seeing it is when, or one of the reasons why it's so difficult to achieve has been more of a challenge than maybe many of us thought it would be to achieve, is that it really requires the alignment of three different areas to line up. There needs to be a technical solution to sharing. It has to be technically possible. Historically, sharing's been, as was noted, time and frequency and geography. We call that allocation, and we're trying to get a little bit more sophisticated. So there needs to be a technical solution to it. There needs to be an economic reason for doing it, and as the economy would say, the value created by sharing has to be greater than the cost of implementing the sharing before that's something that is a good policy, but also something that anybody wants to get involved with. But the third one is institutional. Even if you can share, and even if it makes sense to share, we still find it's a struggle to find a sharing solution. And that's because the institutional structure around sharing can be very difficult. The reasons are different, and we're going to get into these in more detail later, but if it's private users, it can be the problem that you have many stakeholders on one side, so it's very difficult to sort of negotiate with a group. It could be that an odd problem that comes up on the private sector side is that the value created can be so much that it's hard to figure out how to divide up that pie. And we've seen examples of things fall apart because people can't figure out how to divide the spoils. And on the government side, as I said, we'll get into this more later, there's a huge institutional problem with the incentive of a government agency to get involved in a sharing regime, in essence, because they don't benefit. It is much harder for them to benefit from the value created than it is for a private party.
Thank you, Coleman. Andy?
Yeah, Coleman gave a great answer. I expand on it just a little bit. I think there's a need for exclusive use spectrum in certain situations. I used to work for what's now AT&T, and you realize that deploying a network and providing high quality of service and things like that can often require exclusive use spectrum. But I think the issue is not so much whether sharing should be encouraged, but I think we will see it becoming a necessity, not really an encouragement. I think there's less and less clear spectrum, or less and less spectrum that can be cleared and given over to exclusive use, and sharing is going to become a necessity. In the low bands, sharing is almost required now just because of the lack of cleared spectrum. In the high bands, the advantage of going to millimeter wave bands is that you can get large contiguous blocks of spectrum based upon the allocations and things. But even though there's larger blocks of spectrum there, it's still shared. Every band is spoken for. Virtually every band, even in millimeter wave, has an incumbent. And so I think even in millimeter wave, you're going to have to share. So to me, it's not really a question of whether sharing needs to be encouraged. I think it's going to become increasingly necessary. I think we should be developing ways to make it easier to share spectrum while still protecting incumbents from harmful interference.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Lynn?
Hey, good morning, and thank you for having me.
I want some controversy on this panel, though, too. Right?
Yeah,
I was really hoping that Andy and Coleman, they seem to agree quite a bit. So Lynn, maybe...
You're going to be disappointed by my answer because I largely agree. But let me say it's a yes but answer for me, right? I don't think we should pursue sharing just for sharing's sake. We want to get the highest and best use. Now, we heard a lot yesterday, especially from Ambassador Coe, that what does that mean in the context of spectrum use? All these uses are important. But I think we want to drive as much efficiency out of spectrum as we can. And while AT&T supports unlicensed use, sharing use, we of course also support exclusively licensed use. And all else being equal between sharing and exclusively licensed use, we feel exclusively licensed use maximizes the use of the spectrum. It's more efficient operation. It avoids complexity.
You think it maximizes the use of the spectrum,
Yeah,
or
I
the
do. I
value
do
of
believe it.
spectrum?
And part of that is your power levels are higher. You're able to make more efficient use of it. You reduce complexity. You could do your planning and resource use. It avoids a lot of the interference issues raised by sharing. And perhaps most important of all, it provides the certainty you need to drive an economic business case. And so you've seen hundreds of billions of dollars invested in world-leading networks in this country based on exclusive use spectrum. Even in the context of unlicensed, we prefer not to see it mixed with different uses because of the fear of interference, which right now we have with regard to 6 gigahertz. But that said, I think Andy said it well. I think the reality is you're going to see a need for increased sharing. So in that case, we do need more spectrum. We need more spectrum, I think, for each of the uses, but we're going to have more spectrum for sharing as well. Let's see. So the question for me is not should we have sharing? The question for me is, can we clear spectrum? And if we can't clear spectrum, then can you share it in efficient ways that work technically? I agree with Coleman's points that it has to work technically, it has to work economically, and then we have to get the players together to make sure we could get overcome any institutional resistance to sharing. But the last point I make here is I do think it's a band-specific determination. So I do think you have to look at the band, make the determination, and then go from there. Going forward, I think as Andy pointed out, many of the bands are going to require sharing.
So sounds like thus far, at least the first 3 panelists have agreed that you have to ask yourself the threshold question whether clearing is possible in a band before you actually, then take the next step to try to facilitate sharing. Vernita, you have a very unique perspective as the person at DoD with a lot of responsibility for spectrum management. What's your view on this question? I think you're on mute right now, so you have to take yourself off mute.
You're exactly right. I was on mute. No, thank you so much, Ari, and thank you to my other panelists. I don't know if you're going to get any controversy on this question, actually. From a DoD perspective, we no longer have that beachfront property spectrum that we can just clear. So from our perspective, spectrum sharing must be the new normal. For DoD, spectrum sharing means sharing is defined as the use of the spectrum that allows for mutual use without the degradation or harmful interference in a manner that provides current and future users sufficient regulatory protection that does not result in loss of access to the spectrum. And from that perspective, for us, spectrum does not involve relocation or vacation of the band by incumbent users. So again, spectrum is our new normal, and we need to do everything that we can to make sure how we do that. It's a operational need that we can't get away from. We recognize this. Last year, the DoD released the electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy that describes the challenges the U.S. national security faces from threats emerging from our adversaries. So for us, it requires, spectrum, we see the value, and that, again, that's just our new priority and a norm, that because spectrum sharing requires us the freedom to move across, will allow us the freedom to move across bands to keep pace technologies that are being developed so that we can develop and deploy our capabilities and that rely on spectrum.
So basically you're saying that DoD benefits and many government agencies benefit from innovation in spectrum sharing technology with respect to spectrum sharing technologies. DoD stands to benefit if more spectrum can be shared.
Absolutely. I think the United States tends to benefit, and
Yeah.
everyone will benefit if we can share. And there are technologies out there that are being developed that will allow us to do that.
Well stated. Thank you. I guess, we've talked a little bit already about spectrum reallocation. So let's really dive into that a little bit. In recent years, there's been a lot of focus on reallocating spectrum from primarily federal use to primarily commercial use. And although federal users have often been allowed to stay in portions of the reallocated bands temporarily or permanently, the goal of these processes has not been so much to encourage spectrum sharing as to facilitate reallocation of the band so that it can be divided into geographic area licenses, auctioned, and then used primarily to provide commercial services. And this has already been stated by a panelist that exclusive use spectrum, all things being equal, exclusive use is better for provider or service providers view exclusive use licenses, flexible use exclusive licenses as better alternatives than sharing spectrum. So these spectrum reallocations, though, have for the most part been mandated by Congress, largely at the behest of the commercial mobile industry, and have required extensive work, though, by the FCC, NTIA, and the affected federal agencies. You think about the SysMac process as relating to the AWS-3, the reallocation of spectrum, which is now now comprises the AWS-3 band. So they've often involved also intense lobbying by all of the sides affected, and these reallocations can often take a long time to accomplish. Most times take a long time to accomplish. So are spectrum reallocations of this sort the best way to accommodate new commercial uses? Or are there other approaches that would take less time but produce equally or almost equally, equally or better results, or at least results that are acceptable for the commercial sector? So why don't we start with Lynn in addressing this question? And Lynn, I know you've already spoken to this issue a bit.
Yeah, no, so reallocation has been used, and it's been used because it's an excellent way of driving value or deriving value from the spectrum.
Takes a lot of time, though.
It takes time, but here's the issue with sharing. Sharing takes time as well. In fact, sharing may take more time. CBRS, it's going on nearly a decade since the PCAST report. And that's not a knock on CBRS. It was a new technology, right? It was an innovative, it's probably the most advanced pilot of sharing in the world, right? So it would take a long time. But I think sharing takes a long time because you have to work out all the rules, which are complex. In addition, any new sharing methodology is going to have operational risks associated with it that can also create further delay. CBRS, it used the ESC, the enhanced sensing capabilities, but we've identified issues with that. So now there's proposals to move to an incumbent informing capability there. I don't want to say that's necessarily a delay, but it's an evolving technology, right? So I don't want to accept, or I don't accept that reallocation and exclusive licensing necessarily takes longer than sharing. I think sharing takes time. I think it's going to be band specific again. The point I would make, though, is I think time to market is critical. But if you're really concerned about time to market on spectrum, what we really should be looking at is getting a cogent, coherent spectrum pipeline out there. So participants, stakeholders know what's coming and when. Maybe we look at local siting policies to get infrastructure deployed, and we focus on pro-investment, pro-competition policy frameworks. I think those three things will drive speed to market more than any differential between models for sharing spectrum or not sharing spectrum.
Thanks a lot. Vernita?
Yep. Thank you, Ari. So this is a really interesting question. We actually talked about this internally. DoD recognizes that spectrum reallocation is one of the tools to make spectrum available for commercial wireless industry. However, it should not be viewed as the only tool. We do think going forward that spectrum sharing must be the first consideration. Decisions must be based on solid engineering. There are no shortcuts here, and decisions. We need to make sure that we're not undercutting the decisions that need to be made by taking shortcuts. We need to evaluate and determine when spectrum can be made available. So that goes back to Lynn's point about the spectrum pipeline available for new purposes, whether through reallocation or sharing. But for us, you're gonna hear me say this throughout the panel, spectrum sharing has to become the new normal for us as we start to look forward.
So would you disagree a little bit with Lynn that the threshold, the first question the government should ask itself is sharing possible? Is that the first question, or, because that wouldn't be Lynn's first question?
No, our first question is, it's always going to be, can we share? We need to share.
Yeah.
So it's not vacate. So.
Andy, I'm hoping that to facilitate some type of controversy here.
Sure. Okay. I'll start with some soft controversy. First of all, reallocation, clearing the government out of the band is very disruptive to the government. It also can take a really long time. So I don't think, and I, to some extent it depends on the band, but I don't think going forward, clearing the government out of bands and reallocating to exclusive use is really necessarily the best way to go. There's also a consideration here about who can access the spectrum. If you completely clear band, so let's look at the 3.7 gigahertz band. It was not federal users, but it was cleared and auctioned for a tremendous amount of money. And in the end, there were basically, when you look at the totality of expenditures and licenses won, it was basically 3 licensees that won the vast majority of the spectrum. Look at CBRS, though, on the other hand. In CBRS, because it was shared spectrum, and because there's a free tier, the general authorized access tier, and there is a license tier, the priority access license tier, we enabled access to a much greater range of licensees, over 200 licensees in the CBRS band compared to effectively 3 in the 3.7 gigahertz band. And the PAL licenses went for about 20 cents on the dollar compared to, on a per megahertz pop, compared to, for example, the 3.7 gigahertz auction. So it opened up spectrum access to entities that would not have the economic wherewithal to go after exclusive use licenses. So,
yeah, but Andy, at the same time, some of the rules for that, the CBRS auction sort of, they were constructed to optimize that result. I mean, they were counties, the licenses were
the original
counties.
The original rules, yeah. So the original rules were most optimized, but then the rules, of course, changed. The license areas became much longer. The licenses were basically granted forever instead of 3 years. And so we would have probably seen an even greater diversity of the original rules that stayed in place. So the benefit of the CBRS model in that case over exclusive use is it allowed a much greater variety of entrants into the band at a much more affordable price. And by the way, the DoD did not have to relocate anything out of the CBRS band.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Coleman?
Yes, thanks. I do have to first channel my inner Tom Hazlett here and remind Andrew that even though there was only 3 main licensees out of the C-band, there's going to be 300 million users on that spectrum, and that in fact the MRS spectrum is the most shared spectrum if you abstract from the ownership rights and talk about just actual people using it. It's the most shared spectrum out there. But on this point about the government sharing, I go back to I got my start as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office, and so I'm pretty sensitive to federal budgeting issues. And it's worth noting that the exclusive use auctions and the value from those auctions is what motivated the political will to direct reallocations. As you note, they tend to be directed. The economists get involved and we get all excited about, there's value to be created from a trade that, we can identify a band that's more value, that can create more value in private use, either previously exclusively, and I'm perfectly, I think it's just a continuum as to whether it's exclusive or shared at this point. And I take Vernita's point that, it's most of it's not going to be a complete vacating of the government users. But the problem is that the value created, there's a huge constitutional problem with that being shared with the agencies that are on one side of creating that value. And that's that you cannot pay money to a federal agency without it going through the congressional appropriation process. And so you cannot credibly make that an incremental dollar to the agency that a congressional committee won't just take off of their appropriation. So they're unable to they're just constitutionally unable to capture the value that's created by participating in that. The workaround on that, it's imperfect, but I think the workaround on that will facilitate and can quicken these transactions is that barter is possible. So to the extent that it's not a transfer of a property right from a federal agency to the private sector, but instead it's a partnership of a redevelopment of a system where, much along the sort of D-block model, where AT&T partners with and then gets benefit from excess capacity sort of thing. I suspect that's much more the model for federal users, for sharing and transfers from federal users, is that they'll end up with their missions enhanced in a way that that will be harder for congressional committees to just reduce budgets in the alternative.
That's really great, Coleman. That's sort of a good segue into the next question, which gets to incentives. And I guess we'll start by just as incentives for sharing. We'll start by sort of talking a little bit about what you guys perceive as the barriers to sharing right now. As Vernita mentioned, true sharing exists where, an incumbent user and the new users can coexist without the incumbent having to move or change its operations. So I guess I'm going to ask you guys sort of the general question first, to talk about the barriers to this true spectrum sharing. Are they primarily technical, legal, institutional, mindset related? Coleman, you mentioned the Constitution, the appropriations process. So let's talk about that as well. Are they all of the above? Does it depend on, whether the incumbent is a user is a federal agency with a mission whose benefits cannot be calculated solely in economic terms? Are the incentives ever the same for federal or commercial incumbents? Let's start with Andy. I know I threw a lot out there, Andy. That might be a couple of questions, but
sure. Thanks, Ari. I mean, obviously I look at things from the engineering side, and so I look at some of the challenges for sharing from the technical side. I think one of the challenges we've had in shared spectrum, is true of CBRS and true of other bands, is what I believe to be the tendency towards overprotection of the incumbents. I think it comes from several different reasons. But one is, traditionally, like, for example, interference criteria for incumbents, for fixed service, for satellite services, whatever. You look at the history of where those come from, and they typically come out of ITUR recommendations from, a long time ago.
Yes.
And this is back when all of these services had their own bands, and they'll be, well, let's create an ITUR recommendation that establishes our interference criteria. And back in the 1960s, nobody was caring because nobody was sharing the band.
Right.
And so the satellite industry says, okay, we need to be protected down to the 1 photon limit. We can't possibly have a stray photon enter our satellite. Nobody else was paying attention. And back in 1963 or whatever, somebody signed off on that and said, yeah, who cares? That sounds like a good protection criteria. But today we're still operating because now they can pull out this, blow the dust off the ITUR recommendation and say, hey, this is our protection criteria. And, we saw some of that in CBRS. We're protecting some of these satellite dishes to 150-kilometer radius. The area is larger than the state of West Virginia. We're protecting these individual satellites. I mean, it's insane. And you look at a more modern example, you look at the radio altimeters, for example, in the 4,200 to 4,400 megahertz band. They're claiming they're worried about interference from the 3.7 gigahertz service, 200 and 20 megahertz away. And in fact, the 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz radio altimeters actually only operate in the center 100 megahertz of that band for the most part. So there's an additional 50 megahertz of guard band. So they're arguing that we need at least 270 hertz of guard band to the 3.7 gigahertz service. And then if you look at that and say, well, would they need that much guard band on the upper end as well? So that's 540 megahertz they're consuming, plus the 100 megahertz that their systems operate in. They're saying their 100 megahertz bandwidth systems require 640 megahertz of spectrum protected for them to operate. And it's, when you talk about, if you ever get into spectrum sharing considerations with a service like that, it becomes almost untenable to share spectrum. So I think the overprotection based upon of incumbents based upon questionable interference criteria and assumptions, I think is a real challenge to spectrum sharing. I have several others, but I don't want to take too much time. But that's one of our main concerns.
That's a good one to discuss, and you're absolutely right that those protection criteria were created was that all of the stakeholders for that particular service got in a room and basically developed the criteria. The FCC doesn't know. National administrator has to actually accept it full bore. They can take it under advisement, but they often do, accept those criteria. Coleman, you've already mentioned a couple of great barriers. Andy just talked about the technical barrier. What's your thoughts?
So I agree with him that the problem is well characterized by a kind of completely one-sided view of the property rights, the faux property rights that the incumbents get 100% protection. The lens I take to that, though, is that exists, I believe, because there is no mechanism for resolving disputes efficiently between users. And this was the real purpose of my question, Commissioner Simonton, that if you are going to trade with somebody or cooperate with somebody, there has to be a backdrop to what happens if you disagree. And to use his analogy to land, there's rules about how neighbors interact with each other. And if you drive across my lawn, we don't have to go to court because you're not going to drive across my lawn, because if you did, I'd take you to court and I'd win, and we all know I'd win, so it doesn't happen, right? But none of that exists in Spectrum. In Spectrum, if you have a dispute, you have to bring it to the FCC, and as it's set up now, is an inherently political process where lobbyists and political decisions end up resolving this. And there's no sort of rules or set of law about how to resolve disputes between parties. Even the fact that we have sort of all the rules kind of tilted to one side, the fact that if an incumbent gives up some of their property right in a trade and the person they trade with sort of takes more than they were supposed to, there's no good way to resolve that. I'm not so worried that the incumbents have, in a very Coasian sense, it doesn't really matter so much who has the initial property rights, so long as the transaction costs of a trade are reduced. And here, to reduce the transaction costs of a trade, you need good rules of the road and expectations about how disputes between Spectrum users would be resolved.
You're saying basically the government does need to set a standard, but the parties should be able to contract around that standard. It's important to have a standard, but then once that standard is established, it should be possible for the parties to contract around it.
Exactly, just as we managed it with the Spectrum partition and disaggregation rule,
yes.
Right? Yes. Where the government says, here's your license, now you guys can do whatever you think is right, and we're gonna bless it, and there's rules about that. But we need that in the sharing regime, in essence.
And there are, Lynn will know this, carriers often resolve disputes regarding interference at the border of their licenses all the time, right? The FCC sets a standard for what the signal level should be at the border of a geographic area license, and the carriers use that standard and then contract around it. I mean, but they, they have this standard that they use as a baseline, I guess. But thanks, Coleman. Vernita?
Thank you, Ari. So from a technical, I agree, from a technical, legal, institutional mindset, there are incentives or all barriers to increase spectrum sharing. So I do think that we need to think about how do we get beyond these barriers. From a technology standpoint, we all been talking about CBRS. That is one way that we can enable greater sharing. We've seen promise and working across DoD. The CBRS framework has it's showing really good promise, and the MilDeps and the services are all happy with that process. And I know that there continues to be continued discussion on how to improve it. So that was a huge win, I think, for the spectrum sharing, and we can all see that. However, any new spectrum sharing framework, it still needs to be rigorously tested, developed by all stakeholders. Future learning and frameworks may employ artificial intelligence and machine learning. Use of these enabling technologies for sharing will require time and resources to develop, and we believe these investments are necessary to meet the demands of the increasingly crowded spectrum environment. From a legal regulatory standpoint, flexibility is needed to allow for agile, especially for DoD operations. The U.S. regulatory framework is not flexible enough from our perspective for some of our planned operational scenarios that rely on sharing technologies. For example, some of our radars require regulatory flexibility to be able to operate their full potential, and we're continuing to build, and our next generation radars will need to be agile, that can operate across the wide selections of spectrum.
So what you're saying is that you're looking for your radars to have access to what is currently non-federal spectrum.
That could be a possibility. What I'm saying is that you have to have flexibility in your regulatory approach. And right now we're limited to the bands that we're assigned. But what if there's technology that will allow DoD to share with commercial operators, and when we're using the band, they're not going to use the band? So I think we just need to have more discussion and more studies. So
great, thank you, Lynn.
Sure. So let me suggest 3 barriers, and I think they're very similar to what you've heard, but I want to go through them. One is the technical. It's got to work. Federal agencies have missions to accomplish, right? And those missions are critical, and you've got to make sure whatever sharing you have works. Devil's in the details. Are you overprotecting incumbents? Maybe in some circumstances you certainly are, and others you're not. So you need to make it work. Vernita, I think, made the point that you want to have it tested, you want to experiment with it, you want to make sure it works. And unless it works, that's going to be your first barrier. The economic barrier, I don't think you can overstate. This is the investment incentive and what's the business model. CBRS has today, it had even more so in the initial envisioning of it. The idea of hyper-localized temporary licenses that, great innovative, of course, sort of kid in the garage companies could come in, acquire, use, and then move on. But the spectrum alone isn't sufficient. You need something. You need equipment, you need infrastructure, you need investment to make it work. So it goes to that second point about the economics. Can you share in a way that drives a business case that's going to result in investment, an equipment ecosystem and the like, infrastructure, of course. And then the third thing I'll mention, I think Coleman made the point, a mechanism for dispute resolution. I mean, and it goes to detecting the interference, identifying who's responsible for it, and then remediating it. And that's critical. So it's I would say it's across the board. Clarity up front. The less clarity you have about all dimensions of sharing and then how you're going to ensure coexistence is enforced is a critical component of this. I mean, we saw problems in 5 gigahertz with DFS.
Right.
And I sort of highlighted the challenge of maintaining coexistence in a reliable way. So,
and it's remediation of the interference problem quickly. That's key, right? I mean, if it takes you 2 years or 3 years in the case of that DFS and 5 gigahertz, that doesn't help anyone, right? Thank you very much. Well, listen, we've been talking about some of the barriers. Quickly, if you guys could just share with us the success stories, what you think successful spectrum sharing, what has, examples of successful spectrum sharing, and you can talk about specific bands if you want to. Andy, do you want to sort of start us off there?
Sure. I mean, naturally, I have to, come back to CBRS. We are a spectrum access system, or SAS operator, one of 5, with more on the way. Despite the pandemic, we were fortunate enough to kick off CBRS almost completely coincidental with the beginning of the pandemic. But despite that, we are over 160,000 deployed base stations under SAS management right now. So we've had a lot of deployments. Most of those have been outdoor. We have not seen enterprise deployments at the levels that we'd like to see, but that's mostly because most companies aren't back to the office, and we expect that to pick up later. There's a lot of interest in CBRS among sort of non-traditional uses. National Football League, golf, all sorts of sports and racing have been using it. All sorts of very interesting things. The general authorized access, the free tier of CBRS, has been much more popular than I think anybody expected. There's 100 different models of CBSDs out there. Len was talking about you need the equipment ecosystem. We're at 100 different FCC certified models of CBRS base stations. So, we see CBRS has been quite successful so far. We've been working very well, by the way, with the DoD and other components of the government in working out sharing arrangements. I think there are tweaks that need to be made. As we've pointed out many times, my soapbox is we need to move to this informing incumbent capability rather than the in-band sensing, which has inherent faults to it. But it's still, ESCs are working okay. The environmental sensing capability is working well, but IIC would be a much better way to go. And we have not had a single reported case of interference to a protected incumbent in the entire first 18 months of CBRS deployment. So unless Vernita has a stack of interference complaints he's about ready to throw at us, as far as we know, we haven't been interfering with anybody. But so I take that as a relative success.
Yeah, I mean, Vernita, is that all those instances of interference classified, or have there not been any instances to your knowledge?
No, I haven't, not to our knowledge. And then when there has been interference, I do believe that it's been reconciled pretty quickly. We're pointing to the Citizen Radio Service, CBRS. It's a success from our perspective. And it shows how working with FCC and TIA and DoD, we have worked together to accomplish and collaborate and partner on spectrum sharing. And CBRS is a success story. It is has allowed us to look at how we prioritize, as we're prioritizing 5G in the United States. We have been able to make wide swath of spectrum available by spectrum sharing. So I agree with Andrew that we need to, needs to be some tweaks, but I do think that we're working to make those tweaks. But this is a success story. And so I do think that the more we can look at these sharing frameworks as the norm, sharing is our new norm, the better off we're going to be because of the congestion that spectrum is undergoing right now. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Any of Len or Coleman, you want to add anything to what was stated?
Yeah, this is Len. First, I would like to give a shout out to the FCC, which actually has tried a range of sharing models over the years. And again, if you look at the US wireless market, both exclusively licensed as well as unlicensed, we're working You look at CBRS, it's world leading pilot, right? So that has to be said. CBRS, I'm a little less enthusiastic about, only because I think the jury is still out on it. It's certainly far less dynamic than you would think when we talk about dynamic spectrum sharing. Basically, the sharing between tier 2 and tier 3 are scheduled through the SAS. Not a bad thing, but I just want to highlight it's not as dynamic. And the dynamic component about the sensing, the ESC scheduling when service has to go off, has its problems, and it's going to need to be replaced by a different system. So not a criticism of CBRS as much as too early to tell right now. I think the jury's still out. Some of the other sharing experiments or sharing models put in place by the FCC, it's all very context specific, right? So you have contention-based protocols. They generally work 6 gigahertz. They're going to keep the unlicensed uses from interfering with each other, but they're not protecting the incumbent use because the contention-based protocol doesn't work there. TV white spaces, it appears to be working operationally, but I think the best that can be said is how successful is it remains a point of dispute commercially, right? Is that because of a long period of regulatory uncertainty? Is it because the blocks are too small? Is it because there's no investment model behind it?
They also took away, the commission took away spectrum. There's less white space now.
Yeah, that's right. They really jiggered, right?
Yep.
And then you have DFS. We talked a little bit about the challenges there early on, especially with 5 gigahertz. So the bottom line is, I reiterate, the nation has had just extraordinary success with the exclusively licensed model. We have vibrant unlicensed uses. Those are, I think, real successes we should recognize. I do think we need, as we said at the beginning, more sharing. And I think we have to continue to push the technology there. But we have to be sure it works before we go forward.
Thanks a lot. I think.
Can I add 2 points to the sharing regime? Sorry, yeah. 2 quick things to add to this discussion. One is, as far as sharing models, obviously it's worth saying there's not one model. There's no answer. It does depend on the question. We all need a place to sleep at night. Sometimes we buy a condo. Sometimes we rent an apartment. Sometimes we rent a hotel room. Sometimes we use Airbnb. I mean, it just depends on the uses. The other thing I just wanted to bring into this is that from the economic perspective, I need a little mea culpa here about something that I got quite wrong over the years, which is in sharing, you do need a new regime, and CBRS is a nice example where you need some infrastructure. TV white spaces need infrastructure too, but in CBRS, you need some infrastructure to facilitate the sharing. I viewed that as just a cost of sharing, that you have to pay some money, set up this stuff so that you can get to the benefits of sharing. I think one of the things my eyes are starting to open to is that infrastructure could be a whole other benefit, a source of benefit in itself. And I've heard stories, I was out at a Cohen conference last month where they were talking about the sharing regime and the necessity of being able to share puts in place all sorts of technology infrastructure, fine radio, all of that stuff that actually facilitates a whole lot of other things that I think were unanticipated when it was set up. And so thinking a little bit more broadly about these regimes also having facilitating benefits separate from just facilitating the sharing itself.
Yeah, thank you. And Coleman, if you wouldn't mind, before I start asking for audience questions, just if you could help us sort of elicit what we believe, this panel believes the guiding principles should be for government policymakers that want to encourage sharing where they believe it's viable, where viable. Specifically, I think you've highlighted some of the principles that you believe policymakers should embrace. Can you just, again, sort of, tick off your list, and then we'll ask Andy and Vernita and Lynn to do the same before moving to audience questions.
Certainly, the sharing needs to be value enhancing. And I want to be clear that as an economist, I don't mean just economic value. When I say value, and when an economist says value enhancing, we do appreciate that there's a lot of non-market value that can be created. That certainly belongs in the equation as to whether or not benefits outweigh the cost. I think there's a couple of principles. One is clarity of policy. This goes to the sort of enforcement issue. Just be clear about who has what rights. I don't think we should shy away from the fact that incumbents have rights. There may be something offensive about somebody gaining a windfall, but if, as a practical matter, they can block a reallocation, paying them off is really in the public interest, even if you have to swallow a little bit before doing it. And I think with those in mind, the parties themselves that have value, that see value to be created, will guide the process.
Thank you, Coleman. Len or Ann or Vernita, any comments on what principles should be, what the guiding principles should be?
So I have two suggestions of principles. I'm not sure if they're the biggest principles, but from my experience in CBRS, first of all, don't base your sharing requirements and sharing rules on a mountain of worst case assumptions. Look at the end-to-end interference budgets. Don't take the most conservative for every single parameter that goes into the sharing. So don't base your sharing rules on worst case assumptions.
Or like a Monte Carlo analysis or probabilistic.
Yep. Probabilistic joint probabilities. Don't take the 99th percentile of the propagation model plus the 99th percentile of building entry loss plus, on and on and on, because that becomes infinitely improbable. But that's what the rules end up sometimes being based on. Then the second is, and this is timely, I think we should allow sharing frameworks and systems to evolve based upon lessons learned. In CBRS, we had our spectrum access system certified and our environmental sensing capability system certified, 2 years ago. And the expectation is you had your code, you had your hardware certified, it will not change from here until the end of eternity. And we've learned a tremendous amount in the meantime of how we can make spectrum use more efficient, how we can even protect, Vernita's incumbent use even better. But technically, we're not allowed to change our system. There's no process in place to make it easy for us to evolve our system. So I think, future sharing systems, there should be built-in methods to be able to evolve efficiently and quickly.
And so it's interesting because Coleman makes the point about the need for clarity. But what you're saying, in some sense, if you're too prescriptive, if the standards that are put in place are too prescriptive, it makes it very difficult for the ecosystem to take advantage of learnings. The point that you made, Andy, right, about kind of what you learned when as you sort of as the sharing matures, as sort of through the sharing. And
look at it this. I was going to say, look at it this way. The fact that there has never been a reported case of interference into incumbents from CBRS means that we can adjust the dial a little bit, means that, perhaps we can allow operations closer to incumbents or, allow a greater number of CBRS users near an incumbent. Because we haven't caused interference, it means we're overprotecting. So let's take that lesson. Let's reduce the protections by, half a dB and see how it goes, and keep doing that and tweaking the system until we get to that proper. So I don't think it's against what Coleman said. Start with relative certainty, but in order to increase the efficiency, let's learn and adapt based on experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Len.
I'll offer four thoughts, and they're related to our conversation. One is make the threshold determination. Can you clear it? If you can't clear it, can you share it? Is there value? Is it value enhancing, right? So make that threshold determination. The second thing is establish a trusted information sharing process. We heard yesterday the importance of trust, the importance of getting the stakeholders in the room, the importance of good faith in negotiation. And it may be naive, but I do believe if you get the stakeholders in the room and you really talk it through and share data, you can drive towards the clarity, which is my third point. And I understand what Andy's saying about the need for flexibility, but recognize the less clarity, the less certainty you have up front, that's going to translate into less investment, less use. because people will migrate to things they can rely on more specifically. So you have to decide, is this an experimental allocation, or is it something that you really want to put to work? So I'd urge clarity across, all dimensions of who can use it, under what circumstances, what power levels, where, when, which geography, and the like. But I think clarity helps a lot. And then the final point I'll make is one we discussed earlier, which is ensure you have the mechanisms to detect, identify, and remediate interference. You put those 4 things, I think it helps.
Thank you. Vernita, any thoughts on these?
Yes. So I'd say 3 principles that we're employing in DoD right now, especially from the Spectrum Policy Program Office. We're engaged in a whole of nation effort to solve spectrum sharing. We believe that strong partnerships and effective collaboration across the government and industry, academia, and with our partners is how we're going to win spectrum sharing. And if you've spoken to Mr. Moorfield, he has a saying that DoD understands that whoever masters spectrum sharing will own it, and we certainly believe that, and we're working towards that. And that will help us reap economic and our security benefits from this mastery. The second, spectrum management tools we should view as a necessary infrastructure that requires continued investment to meet current and future needs. And also, we may need to look at how spectrum management is done in this country, and is this an opportunity to look at how we reform spectrum management policies. And then finally, when evaluating spectrum decisions, think that federal agencies and federal agency spectrum users, we can't value spectrum based on commercial terms. And I believe Coleman said this. So agencies, we need to, or
mission driven.
Yeah, to use spectrum efficiently, effectively to achieve our mission. It's not based on the commercial value of it. So we have to look at things differently. So if that could be taken into a consideration. So
thank you.
And yep. And I would just add just a couple of things. We need spectrum to do our mission and our operation mission and meet our priorities. And I think, Andrew, you said something about IIC, and I want to just make sure. I don't think that there's a clear definition that we're all on the same page as to what IIC means. I've heard different viewpoints here, and I've heard the viewpoint from NTIA, and I've heard the viewpoint from some CBRS operators. There's different definitions, and if we want to have clarity on IIC, we need to really be on the same page. For DoD, it is one tool in our toolbox, is not the only tool, and this concept before this right now, it's a concept for us, and I believe it's a concept for NTIA. So we really need to better understand what that means for everybody. Thanks.
I just add, Ari, I agree that mission is the important thing. As a citizen of this country, I want DoD to protect us. That doesn't mean spectrum is special. I mean, we need steel for tanks, and despite President Truman's effort, we never nationalized the steel industry because of the importance of steel in defense. I think the same is for spectrum.
Thanks. This has been a great discussion. I know we have a lot of questions queuing up from the audience. So I'm going to now turn to the audience for questions, and consistent with the WISER rule, I'm going to ask that the first question be posed by a student from CU. And we do have Stacy Weber with us. Stacy is a student at CU, and want to give Stacy the opportunity to ask the first question.
Good morning. Thank you so much for just an incredible discussion. It's been amazing to get to listen to all of you. I was really interested in the comment that we need the technology to be there for sharing as well. I'd just love to hear more about either what that technological development is that you might like to see, or an area where there might be need for some innovation. I don't know if that goes to questions and comments we've had today about receiver standards or secure information sharing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the side of technological development too.
Great question, Stacy. Who wants to get us started? Andy?
Sure, I can think of two right off the bat. In fact, I'm glad you asked that question because I didn't get to put my points on the table. So one of the technological developments that I think is important to bring spectrum sharing is improved propagation models. We, might not be the most exciting thing in the world to most people, but we are, as an example, we are basing sharing in the citizens broadband radio service band and in the upcoming 6 gigahertz automated frequency coordination band upon a model called the irregular terrain model, ITM, that was developed by the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences of NTIA back in the 1960s. And the data they used, the empirical data that went into creating the ITM model, was acquired in the 1950s, before even Sputnik was launched. I think before TV discs were discovered. So we are basing spectrum sharing in the 2020s and beyond upon data that were acquired closer to the time of Marconi, much closer to the time of Marconi than today. And that model is in fact impacting how many CBSDs we can put out today and how many unlicensed devices in 6 gigahertz we'll be able to put out tomorrow. So we need investments in better propagation models. And then a little less specific, but I think equally important, and somebody had mentioned it earlier, the dynamic access aspect of spectrum sharing. So right now, CBRS sort of operates on a time frame. Every few minutes, the device has to check in, and if it's if one of the DoD systems come online, they need to shut down within 5 minutes. So that's relatively fast. In the automated frequency coordination world in 6 gigahertz, they have to check in every 24 hours, which is not very fast. But the reality is, with 5G and 6G and beyond coming, we have the ability to adjust system parameters on the millisecond timescales. So I think one of the technologies that would be interesting to develop is to be able to implement spectrum sharing on a much faster time scale. So you can adjust interference parameters on milliseconds or seconds, like time scale. I think that's a longer development cycle, but I think it's a very important one.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to respond to Stacy's question?
So, Vernita Harris, hi, Stacy. Nice. That's a really good question. And it goes last year, DOD, we released our 2020 electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. And as part of that strategy, we recognize that we need to look at how we are planning to pursue technology investment, and partnerships are a part of that. And understanding our capabilities is another big part of that. And so you will see that as we start to implement our strategy, you will see us focus using spectrum as more strategic across the DoD. How are we using spectrum to meet all of our priorities and missions? So really good question, and thank you.
Really exciting. There's a question here. There's an interest in hearing from the panel about kind of your thoughts about receiver standards, FCC receiver standards. It was raised by Commissioner Symington, or the same question was posed to him. Kind of what's your thought about the viability or advisability of FCC imposed receiver standards? The questioner mentions that this issue's been debated for the last 20 years, at least the last 20 years at the FCC. Is now the time.
I'd offer observation on this. I'm not the engineer, so this is not my domain as to what they should be. But these seem to fall under this category of a mixing of a technical right standard and sort of a political reality. And I think if you look at a lot of things, I think GPS might be one good example, but there's others where there might be a technical standard, but regardless of what the technical standard is, there's a constituent that is going to get protected beyond what that standard tells you. And so the problem is that you don't know what you're using. I liked Andy's point about clarity isn't about precision of rules. It's just about knowing the rules you're under, and it's okay to change them over time. But here's an example where the problem is the lack of clarity around these standards more than fine-tuning the technical standards themselves.
Coleman, if you made the receiver standards prospective, you wouldn't, obviously you wouldn't be able to deal with the installed base, that
Right.
problem, but at least, you would be setting certain standards for future.
I think the commissioner is off the call, so I can say this out loud. The problem is not getting the standard right prospectively. The problem is the credibility about how it's going to be addressed in the future.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Anyone else want to address the receiver standard question?
Just real quick, I generally in favor of, in an ideal world, receiver standards would be valuable, but my concern is that they, first of all, they would increase the cost of equipment. If you have standards that make equipment perform better than the typical equipment right now, it gives the manufacturers less flexibility to provide inexpensive devices in exchange for accepting less performance. The other problem is the spectrum changes, and it's going to change even more as we go on. So a standard adopted today or not adopted today might necessarily be the right standard or the right lack of standard for that particular receiver in that particular band in the future. So again, in an ideal world, telling manufacturers that every receiver has to employ brick wall filters, it's a little bit kind of difficult to determine whether that would be worth the cost and ultimately whether the lack of adaptability and able to adapt to changing conditions is really built in there. So I don't know. Generally, I'm in favor of it, but how it's implemented could be a very complicated mess.
Thank you, Andy. Lynn or Vernita, any thoughts on the receiver standards question?
I'm not an engineer, so I'm going to take that question back to my SMEs and get smart on that one. I'm sure they do.
Yeah, and I should take the question back too, but I think it's obvious we don't want old equipment that doesn't have the appropriate filters in it to prevent more efficient and effective use of the spectrum. But it becomes, like everything else, a very case-specific question, right?
Yeah.
Where do you hit that balance where there's so little embedded base and it can be economically replaced versus, there's a lot of equipment out there. It's been developed, it's been invested in, it's spread broadly. And what do you do with that?
There's reliance on it, all the points that Coleman made. Yep.
Yeah, and to Andy's point, each standard, technology keeps changing. And if you put a standard in place, does it very quickly become obsolete? Thank you.
There's another question. There's a lot of questions about CBRS and the CBRS model. So someone asks, how likely is it that we'll see the CBRS model adopted for another band, for other bands in the future? And I know you want.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, I did a presentation for the TAC a little while ago about the evolution of spectrum sharing. And if you look at the model adopted for TV white space, and you look at the model adopted for CBRS, and you look at the model adopted for 6 gigahertz AFC, they actually look remarkably alike. There hasn't been a whole lot of evolution in the structure of how the cloud-based spectrum sharing systems work. Back from TV white space starting 20 years ago to 6 gigahertz AFC that'll start next year sometime, hopefully. So I think the answer to that is the CBRS model really has been adopted. Now, if you're talking about specifically about 3-tiered sharing, general authorized access and priority access, and the incumbents. That remains to be seen. We think there's a lot of benefits to the 3-tier model. It makes sure that spectrum isn't warehoused and spectrum is always used, whether it's licensed to somebody or not. So that remains to be seen. That'll just be situation specific. But as far as the actual architecture of CBRS, that's basically the same as TV white space, CBRS, and 6 gigahertz AFC.
Thank you. Mark Lofquist asked the question, why don't we have more public-private partnerships where DoD is merely a secured user on commercial networks? DoD assets connect to existing wireless networks the same way a DoD test facility uses an electric power grid used by private citizens and businesses. Can we make wireless infrastructure actual infrastructure? So Vernita, I think this is a question that you may want to address, and if anyone else on the panel wants to sort of take a stab at it, please feel free.
So this was a question that came up in our RFI on how we use spectrum and how we access and wireless infrastructure access. So this is something that we're looking at, where we have not come to any conclusion, but we're continuing to study. And so we are also looking to partner with industry to look at how we are using spectrum and the infrastructures that to do that. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Anyone else want to address that question?
Let's have an institutional aspect to it about if you're buying a service, that's something that's subject to appropriations and competing funds in a way that if you build your own infrastructure, you now have it, known it, and it's cheaper to operate. So that institutional aspect of government use is going to influence the outcome of that, even if it's a good idea to lease.
Mohammed El Magazi asked the question, again, it's a CBRS related question. How can the CBRS concept be exported to other countries, or has it been? He seems to think that at the moment it seems to be quite US specific. Andy, can you?
Yeah, it is US specific. Everybody's sort of waiting to see how it works out here. Other countries have adopted sort of a 2-tier sharing model where the incumbent licensee shares with an underlay service. And typically those arrangements have been worked out, between the services, almost like leasing spectrum, not through an automated central thing such as we use in CBRS. So the answer is it really has not been exported to other countries yet. And I think everybody's taking a wait and see. I know Len himself is taking a wait and see approach. And, I have to be honest, we all are also, it is sort of the first extensive shared spectrum deployment. And, we'll have to wait 10 years to see how it all worked out. I think so far it's working out quite well. But, we'll just have to monitor over the times. And I think other countries are doing the same thing. I don't think it's necessarily be 10 years before a country other than ours adopts it, but they are taking let's see how this works out in the US first.
Thank you, Andy. I want to get through a couple more questions. We have a few minutes. Michael Honig asks, can you comment on the challenges and potential benefits of designing overlay rights that enable secondary use and allow bargaining between an incumbent and another service provider who wishes to share? I think we talked about this already during the panel. Coleman, do you have any thoughts about this?
It's a wonderful construct for dividing up a set of rights and then letting the rights holders optimize from there. Same comment about enforcement as to whether or not the rights get to their achievement end.
A lot of questions about suggesting that the government would be better off, sharing using more commercial acts, being using more commercial networks. But so I'll just ask this, Richard Bennett, wouldn't federal users who manage their own networks be better off as customers of commercial networks in most cases? Vernita, you probably have a perspective on that and experience.
So, I'll just talk about it. We are experimenting with that, and so right now we have for 5G we're experimenting. We have a large scale experiment at Hill Air Force Base for 5G, dynamically sharing for 5G, and so we're looking to see those results. Should be, I think, next year, and it'll be an interesting conversation to have with our stakeholders, and we will make sure to communicate that with folks. So stay tuned.
Ari, I'll throw in a plug for commercial networks, right? Obviously, commercial networks, you have the scale, you have the expertise, you have the ongoing investment in upgrading, you have the cybersecurity protection built in. You also have the added benefit of the government agency being able to leverage commercial innovation and commercial off-the-shelf devices that are being provided to hundreds of millions of people across the country. So
absolutely,
throw that in.
Really good points. The last question I'm gonna read is a pretty simple one, but I'd love for all of you guys to think about answering this one. Victoria Sama just basically asked the question, how does the race for spectrum space impact ordinary citizens? I don't know, you could spend a lot of time talking about that one, answering that question, but does anyone wanna sort of?
I'll throw in. The commercial wireless industry has gone from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G, now 5G, and we're planning 6G, right? The rate that the spectrum's critical to that. Look at your unlicensed uses in the US, spectrum is critical to that. Look at how the speeds and performance have grown and latency has been reduced on your networks. There's a lot of investment in technology going into that, but spectrum's critical. So this is a critical experiment to the extent these devices have become part and parcel of our lives, both commercial as well as social. Spectrum's key.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this panel. I want to thank our panelists. This has been excellent. I've learned a lot. Thanks again. And I think if we can give that virtual round of applause, we should do that now. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ari.
Thank you, Ari.
Thank you. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you.